Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak has changed a lot ever since it first released on Nintendo Switch and PC. All 14 weapons have seen several different buffs and nerfs, both directly and indirectly, and these have changed how all 14 weapons are played in the game. And because of that, I have to make a new tier list to address all of these changes because some weapons have gone down but some have gone up 2 and 3 placements with just a couple of buffs. It's actually crazy how some of the weakest weapons have become the strongest. I don't want to spoil anything, so without any further ado, hello hunters, my name is Dark Hero and let's get into it. Starting off with the Sword and Shield. Last time I made a tier list, the weapon sat comfortably around the A to B tier. It wasn't a weapon that stood out among the rest, but it was still quite powerful and able to dish out plenty of damage, all the while being quite versatile. That being said, ever since I made my last tier list video, the Sword and Shield has been buffed in several ways. Among all the indirect buffs that this weapon received through the introduction of several new skills, one direct buff that has been quite beneficial is the buff to Destroyer Oil to replenish some of your sharpness, making the process of maintaining sharpness on this weapon, which previously consumed a lot of throughout combat, a lot easier and so gave space for more skills to be added to all of your mixed sets. Skills like Offensive Guard, which boosts your damage after perfectly countering an attack, and Adrenaline Rush, which boosts your damage after perfectly dodging an attack, became a lot easier to slot in, and in combination with the skill Embolden, made for a very good and complete set that even some beginner players could take advantage of. As the skill Embolden, while active, would not only increase your defense but also increase your invincibility frames when dodging and lower the impact when guarding. Combine that with Agitator on top and you have a very well-rounded offensive and defensive set. Other skills like Powder Mantle, Wind Mantle, and Mail of Hellfire would of course also increase your damage output. And finally, in Title Update 5, we saw the introduction of the skill Heaven Sent from Amatsu, which, when active, will provide you with a variety of different beneficial effects, such as negating stamina usage and sharpness usage, which for the Sword and Shield are very good benefits. So if you are good enough with the Sword and Shield, to the point where you are able to not get hit by the monster for around 30 seconds or so until the skill becomes active, you are then able to replace the skill Master's Touch with some other offensive skill, and forgo Destroyer Oil for a better switch skill instead. All of these additions contributed to making the Sword and Shield an A tier weapon, and further solidified it as one of the most versatile weapons in the entire game. However, it is still not a weapon that is capable of dishing out a ton of damage when compared to the top contenders, but I have no doubts that it is a very powerful weapon, and so it solidifies its spot in the A tier. Now for the dual blades. Last time I talked about them, they were in the A tier, given the many buffs that they got from Rise to Sunbreak. But man, these title updates have been phenomenal for dual blades enjoyers. Dual blades were already quite a powerful weapon, being incredibly agile and mobile, in a game that asks you to constantly be moving around the monster and constantly attacking, and also being one of the weapons that best takes advantage of the elemental damage. On top of that, skills like Dragon Conversion and Frostcraft have been fantastic for the dual blades. Frostcraft in turn offers an extreme boost in power that can be accessed very easily, as the dual blades are a weapon that not only are very fast to sheath and unsheath, but they also recharge Frostcraft very quickly, so you can have access to all of that damage output without really having to change your playstyle. And for whatever reason, Capcom and the Monster Hunter team decided to further buff the dual blades directly by increasing the damage of Spiral Slash, both in its raw damage and its elemental damage output. And well, if you haven't seen speedrunners using dual blades, the optimal way to play this weapon and get the most damage that you can get out of it is to spam Spiral Slash. Which of course gets me to my next point, which is the skills Powder Mantle, Wind Mantle, Mail of Hellfire, and finally Frenzied Bloodlust, the newly introduced skill in Title Update 5 that you get from Risen Shagaru Magala, which creates an additional wire bug whenever the hunter overcomes the frenzied state for 30, 60 or 90 seconds according to your skill level. So when you have all of these skills in combination, you are essentially able to spam Spiral Slash non-stop, and as you're doing it, you're regenerating health, you're creating explosions that deal even more damage, you are regenerating your wire bugs even faster. The damage output of the dual blades has become insane, and what's crazier is just that the only thing you need to do with this weapon is to hold the left trigger and press the X or triangle button. That's it. It is very fast to get this insane damage output out of the dual blades, and the crazy thing about the dual blades is, if you're using the aerial playstyle, you can more often than not use the iframes on the aerial playstyle of the dual blades to avoid attacks and land those spiral slashes. And if you see an attack that's coming your way, you always have Shrouded Vault as a guaranteed way to dodge an attack. I don't think I need to say anything else about the dual blades, but just in case I need to convince you, they have become the second strongest melee weapon in the entire game, and they are incredibly easy to use. As such, dual blades earns the S tier spot on the list, no questions about it. Next on the list is the iconic greatsword. Last time I ranked it as an easy S tier weapon, mostly because of the insane damage output that you can get just by using strong arm stance together with offensive counter to dish out a ton of damage. While it may be as simple and boring to some playstyle, it is insanely strong, and thankfully Capcom noticed that the second playstyle, which was added in Sunbreak with the Surge Slash combo, wasn't being utilized by a lot of people because it just paled in comparison, so they decided to buff it. That being said, it's still nowhere near as good as Strong Arm Stance Counter, which has only been buffed with the several title updates we have received since, but at least now you will be able to deal more damage if you choose to use Surge Slash combo. However, the traditional playstyle of the greatsword with the counter has been tremendously buffed by the addition of a single skill, Frostcraft, which will buff your true charge slash damage by a whopping 30%. I don't think I need to say anything else about the greatsword. It's the same weapon but a whole lot stronger and with even more skills that allow you to stay alive and be a lot more reliable. As such, greatsword joins the dual blades in the S tier. And now it's time for the longsword. Last time I talked about it, it was hovering between the A and B tier, as the transition from Monster Hunter Rise to Sunbreak saw the weapon receive quite a few nerfs that heavily impacted the weapon's damage output and overall performance. Not only that, but the weapon's reliance on skills such as Quick Sheath and Protective Polish meant that it was somewhat harder for this weapon to slot in as many skills as some other weapons. That being said, the addition of skills like Powder Mantle, Wind Mantle, and Mail of Hellfire, as well as the Master's Touch decorations, have considerably boosted the power of the longsword, so it was able to rise among the ranks and become a more powerful weapon than it was initially at the start of Sunbreak. However, the most impactful buff for the longsword, especially for veterans and masters of the weapon, is the direct buff that we received in title update number 5, which saw a whole rework of the Harvest Moon Silkbind attack. With this buff, not only was the radius of Harvest Moon increased, but the condition of sheathing your weapon to cancel the effect had been removed, hunters would no longer be knocked back when touching the ring, on top of its cooldown being reduced as well. This is a fantastic rework for a skill that was in great need of attention. From all the promotional material we saw prior to Sunbreak releasing, it looked like Harvest Moon was going to be a big deal, but as it turned out, it was very hard to take advantage of this skill, and more often than not, because of how unreliable it was, you'd be better off just not using it. But this buff, in combination with all of the other indirect buffs that we talked about earlier, have turned longsword into a monster. It is absolutely insane what people can do with this weapon now. I don't think it quite has the same damage output in terms of comparison back to what it had in base Rise, but it is still a very powerful weapon with a ton of tools available at your disposal, more than a handful of counters that you can use at all times, a very long and wide-reaching weapon that is able to cut through monsters with ease. As such, I feel very well about placing the longsword back in the S tier where it once was in base Rise. Now before we move on to the next weapon, which saw the craziest buff I have ever seen in the entire Monster Hunter series, I do want to ask you guys to please subscribe to the channel in case you haven't already, as only a very small portion of the people that watch me are actually subscribed. Some of you have told me in the past that you thought you were subscribed, but you actually aren't, and I just show up in your recommended a lot, so please double check as it really helps me out a lot. Thank you, and let's continue with the content. Next on the list is the lance, a weapon that, and I'm sad to say this, was previously placed between the B and C tier. Despite being an awesome and versatile weapon that has two complete different playstyles between the insta-block that allows you to parry the monster attacks and riposte with a ton of damage, and the guard dash spam where you're essentially lunging into the monster with your lance, it simply didn't have good enough damage output, but through a couple of direct buffs and a lot of indirect buffs, the lance has become capable of respectable damage. Master's Touch became the go-to skill option when it came to maintaining the lance's sharpness problems, and Embolden was a very good skill to use on the lance because it essentially gave you a combination of the skill's evade window and guard at the same time. So it was a very efficient skill to add to your sets, and thus made it easier to slot in skills like Powder Mantle, Bloodlust, Coalescence, and Offensive Guard. In addition to that, Intrepid Heart is also a fantastic skill, being a very reliable survival tool for players that weren't too comfortable with the insta-guard timings on the lance. Title Update 5 saw the addition of Heaven Sent and Frenzied Bloodlust, which we previously talked about, which were nice additions to the lance, although in the case of Heaven Sent, not particularly amazing for the weapon. Though Title Update 5 also saw a direct buff for the lance in making the Anchor Rage buff last 10 seconds longer, thus letting you use your wire bugs more offensively, which of course works wonders with Frenzied Bloodlust. All of these buffs are quite nice, and they have made Lance again have respectable damage. But the biggest buff to the Lance's damage output comes in the form of an endemic life bug? I'm not kidding here. So one Rampage decoration that is exclusive to the Lance that was added in Title Update 5 is called Guard Bash, which makes it so that you deal damage whenever you block a monster attack. It actually deals a decent chunk of damage, and it's also got hefty stun damage to boot, so you're able to KO monsters consistently with it. Sadly, Guard Bash does not work with insta-blocking and Guard Dash, which are the two most powerful playstyles for the Lance. However, it has this cool little interaction with the endemic life called Gust Crabs. Let me just play the clip for you guys. That is absolutely insane. The damage output that you can get out of this thing is nuts. Now obviously it's not too reliable, it's not something that you can use throughout the entirety of the hunt. Not only do you have to go out of your way to catch these Gust Crabs, I'm also not sure if they are available on every map, and if they are, I'm pretty sure that there's only one, maybe two at most. And I don't think that they respawn either, so if you misuse them, you simply wasted your chance to deal a ton of damage. Having said all of this, I think it warrants moving the lance all the way from C tier into the A tier. Moving right along to the gun lance, this weapon is one that not only has always been underperforming compared to the rest of the weapons in the cast, it is also a weapon that requires you to use a lot of skills, way more than the average weapon does. And for those reasons, the damage output of the gun lance has been, for the most part, less than desirable. All of these title updates have been slightly inching the gun lance forward, but it still could not close the gap between it and the rest of the weapons. That is, up until Title Update 5, because just like the lance, it also got some crazy buffs. The weapon saw a couple of direct buffs in the form of increasing the shell value for the gun lance's worm stake, as well as straight up increasing the shelling damage of the wide gun lance. That being said, these buffs were not all that special, not too significant. A much more impressive buff was in a previous title update where the developers added a system that lets you level up the shelling level of your gun lances. therefore making a lot more gun lances viable to use in the endgame of Sunbreak, which in turn led to more variety when it came to endgame sets. Sneak Attack, the skill that you get from Lucen Nargacuga, was one remarkable skill that you got that increased your damage when using Bullet Barrage. But by far the biggest buff for the gun lance, at least in my opinion, has got to be Frenzied Bloodlust, which allows you to keep on spamming Bullet Barrage with your 3, maybe even 4 different wire bugs. And of course you stack that on top of Wind Mantle, Powder Mantle, Mail of Hellfire, and Wire Bug Whisperer, and you've got a ton of damage output just by spamming this move alone. And I've got to say, it's also a very fun playstyle. The Amatsu skill Heaven Sent has also got to be a very valuable piece to the gun lance user, as sharpness maintenance has always been a big problem for the gun lance. So now that you have access to what is essentially infinite sharpness, Worm Stake spam is also a very viable playstyle for the gun lance now. So if you like explosions, then you are probably going to be very happy with the current state of the gun lance. Having said all of that, I don't think I can put the gun lance any higher than the B tier, but I can also see myself placing the gun lance a tier higher in the A tier as well. Next on the list is the Charge Blade, one of the most complex weapons in the game, that has two very different playstyles which are also quite different in terms of power levels. Firstly, we have the Super Amped Elemental Discharge spam, where the entire gameplay is to load up the shells, charge up your shield, and then use a guard point to boost your damage with offensive guard and follow it up with a Super Amped Elemental Discharge. Because elemental damage has become so powerful in Sunbreak, it is natural that Charge Blade has become immensely powerful, especially with the addition of Dragon Conversion. And of course, Wind Mantle, Powder Mantle, Mail of Hellfire, and Frenzy Bloodlust are skills that heavily benefit the Charge Blade as well. As for using the Spam SAED playstyle with Impact Files, because elemental damage is so powerful, it simply pales in comparison, but you can still use it and do well. Frostcraft is also a very nice skill to use with Elemental Charge Blade, but you may have trouble slotting in all of those skills. As for the Spinning Axe playstyle, now you have a lot more tools available at your disposal to not only boost the damage of your weapon, but to keep on resetting and using ready stance to keep recharging the files and keeping on dishing out damage. And while Spinning Axe may not be as powerful as the SAD spam playstyle, it is still very fun, although harder to use. I believe last time I ranked Charge Blade in the A tier, and I think that is also where I'm going to rank it here on this tier list. Next up on the list is the other transforming weapon, the Switch Axe. And just like the Charge Blade, the best way to use the Switch Axe is with elemental files and focusing on elemental damage through the use of Dragon Conversion, Critical Element, Element Exploit, and Furious. While Heaven Sent may be somewhat beneficial to Switch Axe users, I genuinely don't think it's going to be that big of a deal to the point where you're going to replace any of your armor pieces just to slot that in. Frenzy Bloodlust has become a nice buff for Switch Axe users, but at the same time I don't think that Switch Axe users are the ones that need to be spamming wire bugs the most, as more often than not, the most optimal ways to use the weapon doesn't really require that many wire bug usages. But if you can get one level of that skill without giving up on the aforementioned skills and Wind Mantle, Powder Mantle, and of course Elemental Attack, then it can be a pretty nice comfortable skill to add. Because Switch Axe doesn't really benefit from many of these additions in the latest title update, and its damage output relative to the rest of the weapons has somewhat fallen behind, I'm actually going to drop down the Switch Axe from where I last put it in the tier list, which was in the S tier, and I'm going to put it down in the A tier. It's still a very powerful and extremely fun weapon to use. It is still my most used weapon in Sunbreak. But when compared to the rest of the weapons, it's not on the same level. And now it's time for the bonk stick, the hammer. Last time I talked about the hammer on the tier list, people were not too fond of my placement of the weapon, as I put it in the C tier. The hammer has actually gotten quite a few direct and indirect buffs, notably the elemental value increase in the hammer's charged Big Bang and Big Bang finisher. And I should say that both the classic strength and the new courage playstyle have been buffed in Sunbreak, so when we combine that buffed courage playstyle with all of the elemental skills that have been added and buffed in Sunbreak, with elemental exploit, charge master, wind mantle and powder mantle, we can get some really good damage output out of the hammer, especially now that we have frenzied bloodlust, that in combination with Wirebug Whisperer and Hellfire Cloak means that we can also keep on spamming Skillbind attacks for even further damage output. That being said, there isn't a lot that the hammer does better than the other weapons. Now I think that all of these buffs have been significant in making the weapon stronger, I just don't think that it can quite compete with the rest of the weapons, and so I'm putting hammer in the B tier. Hammer bros, I'm sorry, but I just cannot put it in the A tier yet. Next on the list is one of my babies, the hunting horn. And boy do I have a lot to say on this weapon because it is quite specific with the buffs it has gotten. So obviously all of these elemental buffs are quite beneficial for the hunting horn, but I think more importantly we should talk about how they interact with the specific horn you choose to use. The Autumn Lute, the Amatsu hunting horn, has essentially become the new staple for hunting horns, as it comes with a high water element and an insane raw value that allows it to dominate over other meta options. It also comes with a 3-slot decoration, but in addition to all of that, because it is an Amatsu weapon, it gets a 10% raw damage boost whenever you use Silkbind attacks. And that includes the raw damage of the Silkbind Shockwave, which its duration has also been buffed in title update number 5. This hunting horn in specific comes with elemental attack boost and health regeneration, which is a very important and meta-defining melody to have, because that means you can slap on more skills that will drain your life in order to increase your damage output. And then you combine that with Frenzied Bloodlust, which means you can keep on spamming Silkbind attacks and also regenerating your health. That is going to dish out a ton of damage. And if you're using other horns, of course, for elemental damage, you can still take advantage of Dragon Heart, Dragon Conversion, and all the different elemental skills. A hunting horn's damage output has become quite impressive, especially as of title update number 5. And while it is a weapon that doesn't really take good advantage of the skill Heaven Sent, the rest of these additions have become very beneficial, and again the Amatsu horn further compounds upon this weapon becoming stronger. As such, I think it warrants moving the hunting horn all the way from C tier into A tier, but with the caveat that you have to be very careful with your health, because you are going to be constantly draining health with the meta sets. And now for the final melee weapon in Hunter Rise Sunbreak, the Insect Glaive. Now this weapon, being an elemental weapon, of course is going to take great advantage of all of these elemental skills that have been added through the different title updates. Not only that, but it has also been greatly buffed directly, having the Insect stamina being generally increased, and also increasing the damage scaling for the weapon whenever triple extract is active. In all honesty, this is a very similar situation to that of the Switch Axe, wherein all aspects of the weapon have been buffed. However, the main difference is that this weapon has been directly buffed in a very significant way, as the triple extract damage buff has gone up from a 15% damage increase to a 20% damage increase, but also getting the new Amatsu Glaive means that you have a very good and viable raw option when it comes to meta insect glaives. And so the 80% raw damage Kinsect boost from Kinsect Supercharge simply makes that weapon incredibly useful in all scenarios. So now with this weapon, if you want to, you can simply not specialize in any element, go with the raw version, and you may even have more damage output than if you were to go with an elemental glaive, simply because some monsters just have high elemental resistances, to the point where you're better off using the raw option. And of course, Frenzied Bloodlust is very good to use with the Insect Glaive, because you get to spam your Silkbind attacks, which deal a ton of damage, and are very fun to use, I should also say. Having said all of that, I think I'm going to put the insect glaive in the A tier. It has become quite powerful, but it doesn't have the tools necessary to go into the S tier, at least in my opinion. And now it's time for the ranged weapons, starting of course with the bow. Bow, being a weapon that uses elemental damage incredibly well, has of course become even more powerful with the various different title updates. I don't think it has gotten a direct buff through any title update, but the introduction of all of these different skills have been incredibly useful and beneficial to the bow. Of course, it's going to depend on which bow type you choose to use, rapid, spread and pierce, but, for example, spread up is a lot easier to slot into your mixed sets than it was before. And of course, the same goes for bow charge plus and charge master. Now, I'm not too sure on this, but I think that the Amatsu skill, Heaven Sent, may be somewhat appealing to bow users because of the infinite stamina, but maybe it's not good enough to the point where you have to equip an Amatsu armor piece as opposed to using another one that maybe would give more beneficial skills, like for example a Risen Teostra or a Risen Shagaru Magala armor piece. Adrenaline Rush is yet another skill that bow takes a fantastic use of, as it is quite easy to dodge attacks with the bow, and that is going to result in you dealing even more damage. But having access to Critical Element, Element Exploit, or even Dragon Conversion, Wind Mantle and Powder Mantle all make for a very powerful weapon that has always been reliable and at the top of the meta along with the bowguns since the release of Monster Hunter Rise. So for all of those reasons, and because bow has just become even more powerful and reliable, I'm going to have to put it in the S tier. And now it's time for the bowguns, starting with the light bowgun. Now these weapons have always been insanely strong, always remaining at the top of the meta. That being said, these title updates, especially title update number 5, didn't really give them anything too special. However, the revamped charms and choreographed augmentations allow them to slot in much more powerful skills, as the bowguns are weapons that typically require you to use specific skills, such as spare shot, ammo up, reload speed, and for example spread up in case you're using a spread bowgun. In the case of the light bowgun being such a versatile weapon that is very agile and is still able to output an insane amount of DPS, and one that takes good advantage of all of the elemental damage skills, means that it can very easily take care of monsters without any issues. And now that we have Frenzy Bloodlust, you can spam your Silk Pines as much as you want, making it so that you are a very reliable DPS machine with the light bowgun. And of course, since you're using Frenzied Bloodlust, it means you also have access to Bloodlust, so you have a good way to regenerate health, which then allows you to add Dereliction to further boost your damage output at the cost of some health. Therefore, it is very easy to state that the light bowgun remains in the S tier. And finally, we have the final weapon of the tier list, the counterpart to the light bowgun, the heavy bowgun. Much like with the light bowgun, it didn't really get any direct buffs, and even the indirect buffs it received through the different title updates weren't particularly amazing, but being able to slot in more skills because of the revamped charms and choreographed augmentations means that again you can slot in more offensive skills. That being said, it did get a direct buff in the form of Crouching Fire, which has made normal heavy bowguns a lot stronger. Sadly, if you are a fan of Cluster Bomb heavy bowguns, they are not the strongest, they are actually pretty weak when compared to the rest of the heavy bowgun playstyles, but they are still quite powerful when compared to the rest of the weapons in the game. The same could be said about Sticky Ammo, it's still not the strongest, but it can still be a viable option. If you really want to obliterate monsters without any care, just bring a Spread or a Pierce 3 heavy bowgun, and you're going to have a good time. Again, while it didn't see huge buffs throughout the title updates, it always remains one of the strongest weapons in the entire game, so having said all of that, the heavy bowgun takes its place in the S tier. You may disagree with me in some placements, but some of these changes in the tier list are absolutely insane. If you're in for more surprises, then check out this video where I talk about something that Capcom and the Monster Hunter team has left behind.